Hello, I'm Professor Virginia Charter, and I'm here today with Dr. Brian Hoskins. We are from Oklahoma State University in Fire Protection and Safety Engineering Technology. And today we are going to be talking in this module specifically about the National Fire Protection Association and their development of codes and standards. This is part of a series of modules on the development of codes and standards, and so today is just about NFPA. So as we move forward today, we're going to be discussing several learning objectives. What is the National Fire Protection Association, and how does NFPA develop their codes and standards? How are those codes and standards adopted by local organizations? And how are the NFPA codes and standards organized? So first and foremost, let's talk about what the National Fire Protection Association is. The National Fire Protection Association is a global nonprofit organization that was originally established in 1896. The NFPA is devoted to eliminating death, injury, property, and economic loss due to fire, electrical, and related hazards. They've been around for a very long time, but honestly, their vision and mission have remained pretty close to the same. NFPA is the leading global advocate for the elimination of death, injury, property, and economic loss to fire, electrical, and related hazards. Their mission is to help save lives and reduce loss with information, knowledge, and passion. And because NFPA has been around for such a long time, they have worked in developing over 300 consensus codes and standards based upon research, training, education, outreach, and advocacy. And with that, NFPA has a membership of over 50,000 individuals around the world. And it is these individuals, these members, that work together to develop these 300 consensus codes and standards. As we talk about the NFPA, and now that we know more about the NFPA, it's important to talk about the committee structures that develop the codes and standards that are utilized worldwide. There are technical committees within NFPA that are responsible for developing these codes and standards, as well as then their subsequent revisions. The committee is normally comprised of up to 30 members. However, these members, it needs to be a balance of interests. While they all may be field experts within a given topic, they need to be coming from a variety of areas, and no more than 1/3 of those members can be classified in a single interest category. This is important because it provides balance to the committee and provides us that consensus process that is so important. Appointments to these committees are going to be based upon the overall applicant interest, their qualifications to that area, and the ability for them to participate in the variety meetings that occur throughout the year. As I indicated before, there's a variety of interest groups that these committees are comprised of. And you can see the list here on the slide that there are, they come from different areas. And again, this is so that way not one area dominates a specific code and standard. It helps with meeting the definition of being a consensus standard. So you would have everything from a manufacturer, which could be those that might be manufacturing sprinkler riser valves or fire alarm panels. It could be the end user, so the person that might be utilizing the equipment as it's installed. It could actually be the installer or the maintainer of that. So that could be a contractor that actually installs the fire alarm or sprinkler systems or other types of life safety systems that you might be dealing with within the consensus standards. You could be the consumer of the product, whatever that might be. Also, applied research and testing laboratories can participate in the committees. This is an important interest group because they're sometimes on the cutting edge of the latest and greatest technology that could be input into the consensus standards and codes. The insurance industry is also another interest group that is vital to the committee structure. This is because the insurance group is those that a lot of times that insure the variety of properties that they're trying to protect. And so they have an interest in protecting those properties, just like NFPA has an overall mission of protecting those properties. The enforcing authority or the authority having jurisdiction can also participate as an interest group. They're important because those are your local fire marshals or building code officials that need to enforce the codes and standards. They need to make sure that they're installed properly, that they're tested properly. And so it's this group that needs to be knowledgeable on how to enforce these different documents. You can also have a laborer as an interest group. So again, similar to that of the installer, but falling under a different category. You also have the special expertise. Many times those with special expertise is where they don't meet one of those other categories, but they have that specialty expertise. So it could be someone in the engineering or consulting world. It could also be someone from the higher education world that can provide additional information or viewpoints as a part of the committee structure. So as we talked about, no more than 1/3 of the committee can make up any one of these interest groups. That helps maintain the balance, and it also helps provide the committees as they work through the process, which will be discussed here shortly, that they'll have different ideas and they're trying to address the variety of those interests. You know, are we looking at the property protection from the insurance industry? Are we looking at the actual ease of installation from the installing perspective? And so it's important to have that ease and that consensus with the interest groups.
So now we're going to talk about the process NFPA uses to adopt their codes and standards. The key takeaway I really want you to take from this is that it's very much of a public-driven process. Throughout, on every step, the public, and that means any of you out there, you do not have to have any special expertise, knowledge, training, experience, titles, or anything. Everyone is free to submit information to the committee throughout this whole process. And we'll talk about that as it goes from the public input to the public comment, technical committee, and finally the Standards Council. So starting with stage 1, the public input. Now, the NFPA public input process is entirely electronic. So because of that, as you're sitting at home, a new edition of the code comes out. Let's say this past fall, new edition of a code came out. It's then getting to be the start of the year. You're reading through it, and it's you know what? I do not like what they have here. This is completely ridiculous. The code has to be saying something very different than that. You now have the option and opportunity to propose a change to the committee, a public input. Now, for this public input, you will go electronically through the NFPA system and submit what you think needs to be changed, as well as giving a justification for why you think it should change. It's important to give that justification why, because the committee has to understand where you're coming from, why did you think this is important to change. A non-existent or very poor justification will more likely lead to the committee not acting upon that recommendation. So at this point, the technical committee, that's that balance committee we talked about previously, meets typically in the spring or summer following on the same year that it was issued. And they receive all these public inputs, usually a few weeks in advance to review, and they can now talk about them at that first draft meeting. Every public input that came in, the committee has to review and vote on, and when they vote, they have 3 different options. They can either accept it as is, you know what, this public input makes total sense, we agree with it 100%, we're accepting it, and going to make our first report based on, that proposed change. Or the committee can go, you know what, I like the idea in general, but the language there isn't quite right because not everyone's an expert at writing code language. Even some people who work on those technical committees don't really do well at writing the code language. And so there may be changes that have to be made to make it more within the keeping of the manual style and other normal practices within the code itself. Or it could be something like the committee agrees with the proposed change, but not the section it's proposed to be in. They want to put in a different section. So these modifications can be made by the committee. Or the committee has the option of outright rejecting a proposal or that public input. The reason why these get rejected a lot of times stems from either, one, there's no substantiation of why that change is needed. Because these are minimum consensus standards, the committee does not want to make a change, typically speaking, just to make a change. It is not explained why, what problem will this change help prevent, well then why make life more complicated, more complex? Oh, obviously if the change is delete, that then is something that could be acted upon. And so because of that, poor substantiation will lead to a more likely rejection, as well as in some instances the proposed change is not in keeping with what the technical experts serving on that committee view as being the best option, best policies, and best procedures. And again, that's why we want this consensus process. We have all these different interest groups, because if all these different interest groups and all of them more or less move towards the consensus that, yeah, this isn't really an overly important issue, then there's no reason it should be put into that minimum standard. And so the committee has those. Now, anyone on the committee can also bring up any issues they want addressed, and these can also be voted on and put in as a first revision as well. Also, the committee has the option of putting in committee input. The difference between a committee input and a first revision is that the first revision will show up, it will be balloted upon if no change is made to it in a subsequent meeting, as we'll talk about in the next few slides, then it will be put into the next edition of the code. They also have the option of putting out a trial balloon, a committee input. This is something that if the committee decides not to do anything later, well, it will not become part of the code. However, it's something that the committee feels of you know what, we want to know what the public thinks about this. So again, very much that open process, getting the public involved, and those committee inputs are out there for the public to review as we get to the next phase. Now, at that first draft meeting, it is simply a majority vote at the meeting to give everyone time to think about it, especially the ones representing different organizations, give them the chance to go back, talk to the other people in their organization, and see what their organization feels is the best interest for them and their industry. Then several weeks or months later, depending on just which code it is and how complex the issues are involved with it, those committee members get a ballot, and again, done electronically, they vote. If 2/3 of them accept the proposed changes, it's going to then be part of that first report. If it does not get that 2/3 vote, it's even if it's at 55%, not good enough, not at that 2/3, it will not become part of the first report that gets posted in terms of the new code language. After that, the core lane committee will go through. The purpose of the core lane committee is on, especially those codes that have multiple committees serving, the code wants to be internally consistent. It does not want one chapter or one committee to be saying one requirement and another committee to be saying something different. They want it to be where those match up, and the core lane committee's job is just make sure that, yes, everything's same. Why? Because imagine what life would be like to the end user if the code, depending on which page you flip to, said two completely different things. Which one are you supposed to follow? It wouldn't be clear and obvious what to do there, so the core lane committee helps clean that stuff up. The core lane committee ballots, they also follow the same procedure as we see with the other committees, and then the first report is posted, and this is typically in about a year after that initial publication of the code. So on the typical 3-year cycle, we're now into year 2, where that first report went out and the public has a chance to go over that draft, and if there's things that were proposed changes that anyone in the public says, you know what, I do not like that change, they have the option of submitting a public comment through the Nfpa online system. Or if someone had something rejected that they strongly believe, you know what, this is really important, it really needs to be in here, or if it's something that the committee said, you know what, this wasn't well justified, they come back with a better justification and explanation as to what they're doing, they can do that here. The one caveat for this part of the phase is that no new material can be introduced at this point. So sections that were addressed in either the public input, ones that were accepted or rejected, as I said, you have a chance of, if it was rejected, coming back and appealing, or anyone else could appeal it as well on a similar basis, essentially. Or if the committee had a committee input or any of those proposed changes, that information can be changed at this point here. Now, if there were no public comments come in, it just straight goes now as a consent standard and we'll move forward. However, on many of the committees, there will be a meeting, again, typically about 1 year after that first meeting was for those ones on the 3-year cycle, to go through and determine which of these comments does the committee want to accept, modify, or reject, similar to as they did on that first draft meeting. And so then, as we saw before, simple majority at the meeting. Several weeks, months later, technical committee gets an ballot, and it takes a 2/3 vote. Anything that gets approved there becomes part of the second draft report to then go forward through the final stages of the code process. So now, again, this is year 3. We're now starting into the third and final year of that 3-year cycle. And this one involves the technical meeting. So at the NFPA Conference and Expo, after the conclusion of the exhibits and conference portion of the events, for a day or two, it is just code meetings. All of the codes that are up for revision, that are going to be newly revised and issued that year, will have the opportunity to be debated on the floor of the convention. Now, everyone has the power to make a notice of intent to make a motion, a NITMAM, saying that, you know what, I think that the committee got it wrong. Here's something that should be different. Now, these NITMAMs have to be done in advance. It's not like you can just show up day of and say, you know what, I want to do something now. Why? Because NFPA wants to be able to format things, have it so where the audience can see what's being challenged, and also do things like consolidate. Rather than have 3 people all come up and talk about the same issue that they have, that can be grouped into one issue, one debate on the floor. And so now as the motion is made, it then opens up debate. Anyone who is present, be they an NFPA member or not, is allowed to say why they think the proposed change should be accepted or not. And then at the end of the debate, which can sometimes get very lively, the members of NFPA that are present and have voting rights are allowed to vote on the NITMAM to decide whether or not they want to accept or reject what's been proposed. Now, if it's rejected, it then reverts back to what the committee had originally said. If accepted, now that goes along with the rest of the document to the Standards Council. Now, the Standards Council is the final step of approval. The Standards Council is an body at NFPA that consists of some of the leading experts within the fire protection and electrical safety arena. These are not just people who have entry-level positions or anything like that. They're well-established, well-respected, high-ranking people within the field who understand all the nuances of the different issues that come before the National Fire Protection Association. Now, they'll typically, whatever the committee said that wasn't challenged by anyone, that will be then issued as part of a consent standard. If there were NITMAMs, and especially if those NITMAMs on the floor said, yes, this should be changed, while the committee said no, the Standards Council has a chance to review it to weigh what's the best interest of the entire profession moving forward for that minimum standard in that edition that's about to be published.
Now we're going to talk about how these consensus codes and standards are adopted. What's important to understand is that NFPA does not have any executive power in actually enforcing these documents. These documents need to be adopted by local jurisdictions. These local jurisdictions could be anything from your federal government to your state or local municipality on adopting the various documents. It's also important to understand that the adoption is normally done by code year. So as we discussed in the process, there's an edition that comes out and it's based upon a given year of when that document is actually published. And that's where states or local municipalities look to adopt those specific years or editions. And so it's also important to understand that even many times that the code or standard that is actually adopted may be an older version than the most current version that is currently put out by the NFPA. And so again, and it may just be because of the lag time of the actual adoption process to get to the latest and greatest edition of that code or standard, or it could be by that jurisdictional choice that they chose not to adopt the newest version. Sometimes they like to skip, they go every other version as they are adopting their different codes and standards to ease the process. But again, it's important to understand and know when you're working locally, you need to know what is being adopted specifically by the jurisdiction that you're working in. In addition to that, jurisdictions can also provide local amendments. And so that's important to understand, because since these are code consensus documents, it's important to understand that many times it doesn't address every problem or every issue or every nuance of every local jurisdiction. And so sometimes those jurisdictions, whether again you're looking at the county, city, or state level, may adopt amendments that meet the needs of their local community. NFPA also doesn't work within a box. It's important to understand that NFPA works with the other standard development organizations, so that way there is cohesion between the different organizations, and many times in the second chapter, NFPA will address or cite other publications within them. And so with that, it's important that the different regulatory relations between ICC or ANSI and NFPA, all of which are addressed in different modules in this series, they all work together to make sure that there is a consensus even in between documents, so that way then the documents are all working together as we move forward in codes and standards. While NFPA has over 300 different design, testing, and inspection, different standards and codes, it's important to see that there are commonly applied standards. There's going to be ones that you hear more often than others. And with that, so you'll hear about things particularly related to the field of fire protection and life safety. NFPA 1 is the fire code that is developed by NFPA. There's also the NFPA 13, which is your design for the installation of sprinkler systems. NFPA 25 is your inspection, testing, and maintenance of those water-based suppression systems. And then you'll also see things like NFPA 70, which is our National Electric Code, NFPA 72, which is our National Fire Alarm and Signaling Code, or NFPA 101, which is our Life Safety Code. All of these different documents listed here on the slide, you can see, are the common ones that you'll see that are applied throughout the United States, if not the world. NFPA also works to make sense of their hundreds of standards. And so by doing that, what they'll do is they'll group different standards together based upon the application. So for instance, NFPA standards 11 through 18 cover the various suppression systems that may be installed in different building applications. So design, application, or components and installation. NFPA 11 through 18 covers the different suppression systems. Or another example of that is NFPA 402 to 424 cover fire protection aspects specifically for aircrafts or airports. And the reason why this is important is that when you're trying to make sense of the 300 documents that are put out by NFPA, you might be able to get to a certain area and cover a lot of information without having to look for keywords or search over 300 documents to get what you need to get to.
Now we're going to talk about how the individual codes and standards are organized. So to start with this, I'm going to talk about the chapter structure that we'll see within most of the NFPA codes and standards. Of the 300, the vast majority of them follow this basic outline, and that chapter 1 is administrative information. Administrative information is things that will be beneficial to the people know what's sort of the scope of this code, what does it do, so that way you know if it's the right one for the problem that you're looking at. Chapter 2 is reference publications. We have a reference publication chapter in these codes and standards because when a code or standard references something, for example, the life safety code may say, install a sprinkler system in accordance with NFPA 13. Well, that's a lot easier and simpler to do rather than publishing, and here are the exact steps you have to do, taken verbatim out of NFPA 13. But as we talked about earlier, each code and standard has its own edition year. So when it says see NFPA 13, which edition of NFPA 13? As a user of the code, you would not know unless case you then go to the reference publication chapter to see, okay, this is the edition that it means. And it really saves on having to not have to reproduce everything and give straight guidance to the end user. Chapter 3 is definition. The purpose of the definitions chapter is to make sure that the users of the code understand what words mean in the code. And why is this an issue? Well, take for example the word speaker. Think about for a second, what does that mean to you when you hear it? Well, depending on who you ask, there'll be a few different definitions that we could logically see get applied. One is, well, I'm talking right now, therefore I'm a speaker. So when it mentions the speaker, it's talking about me talking. Or it could reference that piece of sound equipment that pushes sound into a room. Both of those are speakers. Now, which one does the code mean when it uses that word? You'll find that in the definitions chapter. So sometimes also the code will use words in a way different than how we might normally use them in common vernacular. And it's making sure that you know, yes, when the code uses this word, this is exactly what it means, not more, not less than that. And so it's a very helpful chapter as far as figuring out what's going on there and what is meant by things. Now, along those same lines, Chapter 3, while most of the definitions are specific to that code, there are a few general definitions that are good for anyone who uses NFPA codes on a regular basis to become familiar with. These include words like AHJ, authority having jurisdiction, which we have used in this module and others throughout because it's one of those common words that gets used over and over again. The AHJ, as we've mentioned, is that person who has the authority of enforcing the rules and regulations for their jurisdiction, and so the code's going to make reference to them as one term, even though they may be referred to as a building official or a fire official or whatever it may happen to be in that particular jurisdiction. The codes are saying whoever it is, that's what applies. Similarly, you'll see words like shall, which anytime you see a word shall in a definition or in a provision in the code, it's a requirement. You shall do it means you have no choice in the matter. If you're following the code, you will do that. On the other hand, there's also the word should that gets defined. When you see the word should, that means it's a best practice, a recommendation. You don't necessarily have to do it that way, but it's the way that this panel of experts, that technical panel thinks is the best way to do it. Similarly, you'll see definitions for words like listed, labeled, and approved. Then Chapter 4 is general requirements. This chapter more or less sets the foundation for the rest of the code of here are general rules that are going to apply everywhere. What's this really about in this code or standard? Now, after that, it's going to be up to the individual code or standard as far as how the exact chapters are organized. Keep in mind that sometimes they'll use a reserved chapter there. So, for example, in NFPA 101, we have new construction is even chaptered, existing construction is in your odd chapters. And there are some occupancies where there is only one set of requirements. So because of that, they'll use reserved for that odd number chapter, so that way it keeps that even odd pattern all the way through. Similarly, even within the sections and subsections of the chapters, we can see the word reserved used when they have a specific numbering scheme of this subsection always refers to this type of activity, and they want to keep the numbering consistent throughout. We'll see the word reserved used. Now, as far as you have your code, how to find information in it. I usually recommend starting with the index because there you can look up the key terms or phrases that you think are going to apply to the project you have at hand. If that doesn't work, then you go to the table of contents, which will guide you more in the general of this is a chapter and section you probably want to look in, but will not give you as specific of guidance as to which exact paragraph you want to be looking at. Now, within the code, there's also different markings that help you navigate it. For example, NFPA uses an asterisk after the section number to indicate that there's information in the Annex A of the material. What's Annex A in the code or standard? Well, Annex A is the one that gives reference and guidance to those sections within the code. So because the code within the text itself gets adopted into law, some things have to be written in a way that may not be very clear to the end user, and anyone who's ever read code knows that while the words are English, it may not always read like English reads. or whatever language it is, it's going to be the same thing there. This in annex is an attempt to explain, here's what we mean. The committee can explain, here's what we mean by this. When we say to do this, here's why you do it, here's how you do it, or things along those lines. Also, if there's any examples of, well, you should use something like this. So, for example, a form like this would be a good idea. They don't want to put that in the code itself because that would then make it a requirement. Or if there's examples of, well, different occupancies, well, here's a wide list of them, and we're not going to necessarily cover everything, but it'll give you a good guidance on something sort of along these lines here. Also, as far as navigation goes, we'll see that the code, and depending which edition you're looking at, this has changed throughout time with the NFPA codes and standards, but they will mark information that has changed from the previous edition. That is a very beneficial tool that many people use. Why is that beneficial to know what's changed? Well, as we talked about, codes get adopted every cycle, and if you've changed from one edition of the code to the other, so you've been using one edition of the code for the last several years, and now you want to know, well, there's this new code out. What's different from what I have been doing? Your choices, if there are no markings, are to read through the entire code and hope you don't miss anything. Well, that can be a very time-consuming, exhausting, and error-filled process. On the other hand, by seeing a clear indication of something was added here, something was deleted here, you can then know, okay, I have to pay attention to that section in particular because it's going to be different from what it has been before. And so because of that, the code with the asterisks relating you to Appendix A and with those other markings helps navigate through the code. Now, additional appendices are potentially included in some codes and standards, and those tend to be things that are even further information, reference information, to be used as far as a general reference type application. So finally, what are sort of the takeaways from this module? First, what is NFPA? Well, NFPA is the National Fire Protection Association. And remember, the National Fire Protection Association, what they're really about is preventing the loss of life or injury or loss of property due to fire and other related hazards, including electrical and other disasters. And so because of that, NFPA has this wide scope, but they do it through all their different codes and standards to help give guidance of how do we keep these things safe. Now, these codes and standards are then developed by the consensus process, going through where the public has chances throughout to weigh in and give their opinion of what needs to be changed and what should stay the same, as well as having that technical committee of experts in the field being able to weigh in as well. Then after that, we get to the adoption process, remembering here that NFPA cannot dictate that their codes or standards get it required into law anywhere. It's up to the local jurisdiction to adopt it themselves, and that's done by the edition year. And how are they organized? Well, we talked about the different series to help guide through it, as well as the guidance within the codes and standards, for example, the chapter layout and different markings within the code. So this has been our module on the National Fire Protection Association. Thank you.